Well, it's not just here in Canada, but the world is reacting with outrage and condemnation to the reports of chemical weapons being used in Syria. U.S. President Barack Obama has said using chemical weapons against civilians would cross his so-called red line. Has time finally run out for a diplomatic resolution to the crisis? Is it time for a military response? I'm joined now by Paul HEINBECKER, Distinguished Fellow at the Center for International Governance. He's here with me in the studio. And in Washington, Mark Dubowitz, Executive Director of the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. Welcome to you both.
Thanks, Chris.
Nice to be here.
Mark, let me start with you. I listened to John Kerry very carefully. He says there's no doubt chemical weapons were used. He called the images sickening, yet he's waiting for more intelligence, he says. Do you think there's a reason to wait?
Well, Chris, I think there's a reason to wait because I think the U.S. is now preparing military assets so that they can strike at the Assad regime. I don't think that we're going to undertake CSI Damascus and look for forensic proof of who actually has used those weapons. Senior administration officials on background have spoken to major media, and they are almost certain that it was used by the Assad regime against Syria's people. So now I think it's just a question of the timing of this and the application of force, and the scale of that force. Will it look like surgical strikes against certain assets? Would it be a full-scale airstrike campaign? I think that's what we're waiting to see.
And concerns, do you have any about a broader conflict being brought on in the region if that's what happens?
Well, I think there's always concerns that this may spill over into other neighboring countries, but it already has, actually. I mean, I think 2.5 years of inaction by the international community has already embroiled countries like Jordan and Turkey and Lebanon in this conflict. I think my deeper concern is that inaction may have really devastating consequences for the non-proliferation regime and send a message, particularly to Ali Khamenei, Iran's supreme leader, that he can continue to move forward with his nuclear program and do so with impunity because the United States is not willing to commit and adhere to its own red lines.
Paul, you haven't been at the UN for a few years, but you know how it works. Yes. Is it possible to get a resolution to allow for military intervention, and is it time to do that?
I think it's time to try. I think the Russians will veto it, along with the Chinese, and there might be some others against it. But we had the same situation in Kosovo, where there was an attempt to bring the slaughter that was taking place in Kosovo to the UN Security Council. The Russians vetoed that. But the world took the view that if international law forced you to stand by while people were being slaughtered, then the law was an ass. And NATO, with others, formed a coalition of the willing and brought about the end of the Kosovo conflict. And the Russians at that time were strictly against intervention. But when the issue was put to a vote in the UN Security Council, they vetoed it, but they lost in numbers 12-3.
Is there any doubt in your mind that chemical weapons have been used by the Assad regime?
There's no doubt in my mind that chemical weapons have been used. There still is a residual slight doubt that it was by the Assad regime. But here we're in circumstantial evidence. Why would the Assad regime not immediately cooperate? If chemical weapons were used in Canada, what would be the stance of our government to try to obscure something like that? And why did the regime go on shelling that very same area for 5 days afterwards? So there's I think when one of the things that President Obama said was that you either had to have a UN Security Council resolution or evidence that you could bring forward that was persuasive. Kerry used almost exactly the same words, that they were going to bring such evidence forward. And what I'm expecting to hear is about intercepts of conversations and so on, where they're identifying the people who perpetrated this act.
Mark, Paul HEINBECKER talking about what they might be waiting for. We did hear John Kerry saying that there's more intelligence that will be shared in the coming days. Obama has drawn this red line, and he has, I think, got the support of the Republicans to act. So as we look ahead, what will they try to achieve? How long might it take to have some impact on the Assad regime if there isn't a military strike of some sort?
Chris, it's hard to know. I mean, is this going to look like President Clinton's strikes in 1998 against a Sudanese pharmaceutical factory and Al-Qaeda training camps in Afghanistan, or is it going to look like I think as Paul alluded to, the Kosovo air campaign, which was a sustained air campaign that was really designed to degrade and ultimately decapitate the Milosevic regime in Serbia. It may be somewhere in the middle where the U.S. will use cruise missiles, potentially the Air Force, to take out Assad's Air Force, to go after the Syrian brigades responsible for actually using the chemical weapons, to go after other Assad regime assets, possibly extend that to create a no-fly zone to protect the opposition and give them the opportunity to begin to mobilize, to tip the balance of this war back against Assad. I mean, again, I think it'll be a fairly target-rich environment, and it's above my pay grade to be identifying specific assets that the U.S. military will go after. But I imagine that Obama wants to send a very clear message to the Assad regime, to Iran, and to Hezbollah that he doesn't bluff and that he's serious about enforcing red lines, and that America's core national security interests are at stake here, both in terms of the Middle East as a core strategic region and the consequences of WMD proliferation in that most volatile area.
I wanted to ask about the aftermath, because we've seen through the Arab Spring regimes toppled, and we're not necessarily clear who comes next, particularly important in Syria. What can be done as we look ahead, if that in fact is the case, that military strikes are done as Mark describes, to ensure that there is stability that emerges from that very important country?
Well, it's extremely difficult, of course, but I think there are a couple of things to say in response to that. One is that we have to remember our history. I mean, the Russians have been bringing up Iraq and trying to allude to the mistake that was made in Iraq, which I agree with was a mistake. But you have to learn from history, but you can't be paralyzed by it. You have to get the right historical references as well. You have to have the right objectives, and that is going to be extremely important. If somebody said to you, we're going to set up a Jeffersonian democracy in Syria, then you know that that's an unachievable objective, and that's a recipe for in eternal conflict. But you can step back from that, as we've just been discussing, and I think that that's the important thing. What we're losing sight of here is the moral issue. We've talked about the strategic interests of the United States and others, ourselves as well. We've talked about the region. But, there are already 100,000 dead, 2 million refugees, 4 million people displaced, children who are going to grow up completely traumatized for the rest of their lives. We've seen the deaths we've seen in Syria, the Médecins Sans Frontières saying that it's 350 dead, 3,000 injured in 3 hospitals that they're responsible for. So there is a moral issue here as well as a strategic issue. And the moral issue is we cannot allow this kind of slaughter to go on. That's what the responsibility to protect is about. That was a Canadian initiative, and we should be pursuing it. Okay,
Mark, very quickly, respond to that. Is that part of the calculation Obama's making?
Look, I think it is part of the calculation, and I completely agree with Paul, and I think Secretary Kerry talked about acts that shock the moral conscience of the world. But I think it's very important that the responsibility to protect doctrine, which is to intervene when you see a humanitarian slaughter, it is something that is very compelling. It's being used in the past, particularly in the Libya intervention, but it needs to be coupled with a strategic rationale, and I think that's what the Obama administration will seek to do. It's very important because there are mass slaughters taking place everywhere in the world. The United States cannot be expected to intervene everywhere where people are getting slaughtered. A moral strategic calculus coupling both provides the absolute predicate to take out the Assad regime's core assets on the ground and send a message that the use of WMD in the heart of the Middle East will not be tolerated.
All right. Thank you, Mark, and Paul HEINBECKER. Appreciate your insights on this very important issue.
Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Bruce.